Right, so we're going to get started with this next one. So the anatomy of an NIH grant. What are we going to do with this? So we're going to review the process of NIH review so that you understand what happens to your grant once it leaves you. We're going to understand the components of an NIH grant so that you can develop a submission strategy. And we're going to identify some pitfalls in the construction of a grant. This is not a grant writing course. You can't do that in an hour. You can't do that in a day. There are some very good grant writing courses that are multi-day. There's a very good grant writing resource that I'm going to talk about at the very end. I'm not selling it. I have no relationship, but I think it's the best out there. But we're going to talk about having a vocabulary and a general approach to the construction of a grant and appreciation for what goes into it so that you can have your head wrapped around what it's supposed to look like at the end. There's lots of ways to do this. I'm going to share with you how I do it. I have had success doing it this way. There is no one way to do it. Your mentor, whom you've now found, having attended the last lecture, is going to teach you their way of doing it. And if you've chosen your mentor wisely, they have experience, and they understand how to construct a successful grant application, and they're going to teach you how they do it. Again, there are grant writing workshops around, including here at Ohio State. So I would take advantage of those as your schedule permits. Matter of fact, I'd make time on your schedule for those grant writing workshops if you want to be an NIH-funded investigator. So it starts by looking for grant opportunities. We're going to focus on the NIH, and we're going to focus on Ks, mainly because the NIH is the flagship gold standard for biomedical research funding in the United States. It's what division chiefs and department chairs and deans recognize as the currency of facultyhood on the research front. There are other sources besides the NIH, to be sure, but it starts with finding the right funding announcement. Now, if you go onto the NIH website and sign up to get emails about funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs, there's lots of alphabet soup here, by the way. Feel free to call me on it if I use jargon. But if you get on the listserv for their table of contents of funding opportunity announcements, you can see them pouring in week after week. And some of them are very specific. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But there are also general grant announcements, so-called parent announcements. So these are grants without a subject matter attached to them. A K08, a K23, an R01. It can be about whatever you want, but it's got to be good. This is in contrast to other types of funding announcements where they say, we are looking for applications targeting this area of science. You can respond to those, but you can also write something unsolicited and submit that, as long as it's good science. These make up the majority of the NIH's submissions. They might, however, tell you what they want, either in the form of an RFA, or a request for applications, or a program announcement, or a PA, or PAR. So these are opportunities for the NIH to say, or an institute within the NIH to say, we would like stroke grants. We would like sepsis grants. We want child abuse grants. And they'll tell you in that funding opportunity announcement if it's applicable to your kind of work. They'll have a description of what kind of studies they want and the rules and regs about who can apply and what kind of a grant it is. Sometimes those funding opportunity announcements come with set-aside money, and those are called RFAs, or requests for applications. So if there's an RFA for a stroke program, you might say, we have set aside $5 million to fund 5 meritorious applications in the field of stroke. These are our research priorities within the field of stroke. These are the kinds of projects that we anticipate funding. That's nice, because you know they got money. And you might have a better shot of getting that money if you write an application that's spot on for what mission they have with that RFA. Now, odds are other people in the world have noticed that RFA who are in the stroke research environment. So the competition is usually pretty stiff for those. Program announcements are similar in that the institute will say, we want to have grants on sepsis. Please submit grants on sepsis. And here are the kinds of grants that we're looking for, but they don't have set-aside money for them. And you are competing with every other grant, the parent applications and others that go to study section that cycle. So there's no set-aside for program announcements. However, it can give you a clue about what a given institute might want to fund, and you can then route your application to that institute. How do you find these things? Well, you go to the internet and you go to nih.gov and you can investigate what grants are available by searching for keywords like stroke, sepsis, etc. You can look and search by institute to understand what NIGMS or NHLBI is funding and what their priorities are. Once you find a specific offering, you can read about it. And so this happens to be Selected Topics in Transfusion Medicine, which is an R01 level grant. We'll talk about that in a minute. This happens to be a program announcement, as evidenced by its PA designation. It's going to go to a special study section as opposed to being reviewed in a general study section, which is what the R means, PAR. If this was an RFA with set-asides, this would say RFA 13026. Okay? It tells you about why they're offering the funding opportunity, due dates, and other technical issues. You want to make sure you're applying to a grant that's still active and that its submission cycle is known to you. And it tells you a lot about what kinds of grants they want. So these program officers at the NIH have sat down and created, I know you can't read that, but they have created an announcement that tells you, the investigator, we want to see your work, and here's what we want. It's nice. Now, fellows apply for F awards, pre-doctoral, okay? Postdoctoral. K awards are typically for junior faculty. They can be re-entrant awards for mid-career faculty, but most of the K awards go to junior faculty, and these are mentored training grants. So you have to have a mentor. The mentor writes a whole section of the grant. You, as the trainee, are going to be learning new tools and techniques that you don't already know, new tools in your toolbox, as they say, and you will be judged on your career development plan along with the science that you propose. Now, the NIH has a couple different flavors of K awards. K08s represent projects that are basic and early translational. K23 are projects that are clinical or late translational. There's also a newer mechanism within the last 10 years, the K99R00, sometimes called the kangaroo grant because it kind of looks like that. K99R00s are designed to have 2 years of a mentored experience followed by 3 or so years of independent R-level funding. You transition from the K phase to the R phase based upon certain milestones and metrics, and if you don't make the cut, you don't get the R bit. All right? But these are designed for more sophisticated scientists. So I typically think, so these are people who don't need a 5-year mentored experience in order to become independent. I kind of think these are designed for PhDs and MD PhDs who come in with a very sophisticated science background. Most of the people whom I have mentored have been MD trained and or it's not all true, but most of the people I've trained have benefited from the longer duration of mentorship. But I know people who've been successful in the K99 pathway. Our series are for independent investigators. You don't need a mentor to be on the grant. I almost said you don't need a mentor. We all need a mentor. I need a mentor, right, for things that are going on in my life. But you don't need a mentor on the grant for an R award. Now, you probably do want or need co-investigators, collaborators, co-PIs, whatever you might want, to do team science. But you, as the principal investigator, can submit this in the sole PI role. They might be smaller grants like R03s and R21s that are smaller in dollar value and typically shorter in duration, or they might be the big flagship awards, the R01s, the premium research awards, or the big or aircraft carrier awards, the U awards and the P awards, program projects, and so forth, where you typically have multi-investigator, multi-center work, multiple R01 size grants lumped into one big project that has a usually multi-million dollar price tag. We're going to focus here because that's where I think most people with successful NIH careers start. So these are a great career step at whatever level. You don't have to have one of these. You can compete for an R right out of the gate if you're exceptional and you have exceptional science. It's really difficult to get an R award without some NIH funding on your resume. Right? So Ks are a nice way to do that. I've seen people get R03s and R21s right out of the bat if they've had really good experience and potentially some other funding outside the NIH as a fellow or junior faculty member. But by far, the more traditional pathway is a K award. These Ks buy your time. So it pays your institution about $100,000 in salary support so that you can be removed from the clinical environment and devote your time to science. So you, as a junior faculty member in this sort of environment, are not generating clinical revenue. You're a money loser for the institution. This helps offset that. You must devote at least 75% effort to the work. Right? 75% is kind of a lot. Right? And so that's why the salary support is so significant. That's why it's there. For some, but not all, surgical subspecialties, I have seen exceptions to the 75% rule, nothing less than 50% though. So for some surgical subspecialties, because you have to have your caseload maintained and so forth, they'll grant you a 50% or so protected time arrangement. But for all the medical subspecialties, 75%, no negotiating. So most folks do their K or get their K within 5 years of the completion of their training, their fellowship training. I have seen some people use re-entrant or career transition approaches to get back in the game after some time as a clinician beyond 5 years after training. But most go out pretty early to the K approach. We talked about protecting time and space. This should be a more limited project than would be fundable in an R01. The idea is you're learning some new thing that you don't know how to do, so it needs to be of appropriate scope. It gives you that track record of NIH funding on your resume. You will be judged not only on your science, but on your mentor and the experience and track record of that mentor, the institution and the environment in which you are working, and your training plan. We're going to talk in some detail about that. The science is key too. If anyone tries to tell you that, oh, your K award, that's judged all about your training and your candidate's background and your career development plan and your mentor, the science is really secondary. It's not. It's not. So nobody is going to go into a K award with a lousy training program. All right? Anyone who's serious about it won't. And that's frankly the easiest bit to write. So you're starting by competing with people, all of whom have great career development plans and mentorship plans. Now they're being judged on their science about who's going to get funded. So how do you start? Well, it starts with an idea. It starts with an idea that you vet locally with your mentor. Ideally, you've been spending a year or two gathering preliminary data to support the hypotheses that you have. And you're going to come up with a series of experiments, a series of hypotheses that you're going to test in this application. And you might wonder, well, is this enough? Is it too much? Is this the right kind of science that this institute wants to fund? Well, it turns out that there's a person there who can answer that question. And so every institute has multiple program officials or program officers, and they have a portfolio of grants. Every grant that's funded by that institute is overseen by a program officer. And that program officer is the one who writes those funding opportunity announcements, like the ones we just read. So they know what the NHLBI wants to fund. And they have been around the block a time or two, and they can get a sense of whether a set of aims is compatible with that mission and or over or under ambitious. Now, they can't give you direct feedback. I think this would be funded. They can't say that. They have to be a bit cryptic in the language that they use with you, but they can tell you and say, yeah, I think this looks a little overambitious, or I think this might be better for NIGMS rather than NHLBI. And if I'm using alphabet soup, those are just different institutes within NIH. You can find these people. They are publicly available. You can email them. Their email addresses are there. You can call them. I tell you from experience, they like to be emailed before being cold called. They like to have a chance to read what you have to talk about and then schedule a time to talk. But they are specialists that can give you insight. They also can advocate for your grant. If they say this project is smack dab right in the middle of what we want for this institute, I'm going to keep my eye out for it, and I'm going to pay close attention to the review. And program officers have the ability to adjust a grant's position in the queue for funding a little bit. And so they might actually improve your likelihood of being funded if they know about your proposal and they support it. So early, clear communication with your program officer is very helpful. And that includes Ks and Rs and beyond. Now, the NIH funds things in cycles, and the typical cycle for Ks and Rs is 3 times a year. And you would submit, let's say, in February. That grant would be reviewed in June. And the council of that institute, which draws the funding line, meets in October. So you submitted your grant in February. The earliest you could get your money would be December or January of almost a year later, right? So it takes a long time to get that feedback. Now, you should then think about when you want to submit and then wind the clock back to when you should start with your writing process. Now let's talk for a little bit about study section. Really, really important, right? Study section is the group of individuals who reviews grants and scores them and prioritizes them. About 30 people make up a study section. Interestingly, those study sections are not institute specific. They are independent of the institutes. They will send your grant to whatever institute both you and the NIH think is appropriate, but they are independent of institutes, and they are grouped by subject matter. 2 or 3 volunteers. Volunteers, okay? I think you get paid like $200 to go to study section. Right? Barely covers your travel. I mean, they pay for your flight, but it barely covers anything. Right? These are our non-NIH people. Professors, associate professors around the country who are themselves NIH funded, who are solicited to take part in study section. It is a community service, and they get, each of them gets maybe 6 or 8, on a bad day, 10 grants to review at a study section meeting. And that study section meeting happens 3 times a year, right? And so 3 times a year, they get this big file in email of grants to review, right? The part that you write of the grant, as we'll talk about, is somewhere around the 20, 30 pages, okay? The grant itself, with all of its administrative sections, can run north of 300. The biggest one I've ever reviewed is 1,000, right? Now, I don't have to read every page of that with fine detail, but a lot of them I do, right? And I'm busy. We talked about this last hour, okay? I'm reviewing grants first thing in the morning, after the kids go to bed, on the plane, on the train, 10 o'clock at night. I am angry when I pick up your grant. I'm in a bad mood because I'm tired. I got all my other stuff to do. I'm doing this on top of it. Now I got to read this thing, okay? If you piss me off, I'm going to put that grant away. And I'm not going to score it well. How do you piss me off? By writing in a confusing way, by being unclear, by having it be unpleasant to read, by having it be unenthusing, right? So you have to think about your reader when you are writing a grant. So you got 2 or 3 volunteers who will get your grant in toto, and they will be responsible for reading it cover to cover and providing a review, a preliminary score, and a detailed critique of your grant. There may be 30 people in that study section room. 2 or 3 have read your grant, okay? Those preliminary scores from all the grants from the study section go in, and they don't have time to review all 100 grants that were submitted that cycle at that study section. So they will lop off the bottom half of scores and not even talk about them. They will not be discussed. You will get no feedback other than what those 3 people read at 10 o'clock at night at their house when they were in a bad mood. Okay? So if your grant was triaged, the official terminology is not discussed, it's a bad thing. And it means you didn't make the 50% or so cut to merit even discussion at the study section. So if your grant gets triaged, it means there's a big problem with it. This doesn't mean you shouldn't revise and resubmit, but it means there's a teardown to be done here. And you want to read those critiques and redo it extremely aggressively because the proposal in its current form is essentially dead. Now, the study section will then meet either in person, typically in Bethesda, or increasingly by webinar, just for money reasons. And every grant that makes the cut to be discussed will be reviewed. And what will happen is that those 2 or 3 people who have read your grant in its entirety will get up and talk. And they will go through the review criteria, and they'll discuss your grant in gory detail, and they'll provide oral critiques. And then they will say what score they gave your grant. Everybody else in the room may have read your abstract or your specific aims page. Right? They will probably be doing that while the discussion is ongoing. But they will not have read your grant. Those 2 or 3 people are the only ones who will. So those 2 or 3 people hugely color the scores that other people give your grant. So what happens is, after all those 3 reviewers have talked about your grant and people in the room have been able to ask questions, those 3 reviewers will be asked to revise their scores. You want to change your score based upon what the discussion has been. Sometimes they bring your score up, sometimes they bring your score down based on that discussion. And then those 3 people provide revised scores. And they take the lowest and the highest of those scores, and they say, all right, everybody else in the room, you got to vote somewhere between those 2 scores, the lowest and the highest of those 3 people. And if you want to vote outside that range, you got to raise your hand and tell us why. How many times do you think that happens? Almost never. Okay? So those 2 or 3 people essentially decide what score your grant gets, because everybody else has to vote between their scores or expose themselves as to why they differ. Okay? If those 2 or 3 people are made to be in a worse mood by how you write that grant, your grant is dead. Right? So you have to spend every bit as much time writing this proposal as you do thinking about the science that goes into the proposal and gathering the data. It's a huge time commitment, and as much as nothing can be perfect, it has to be close to perfect as you can make it. So you're scored on significance, investigators, you, the innovation, the approach, the environment, and then an overall score is given, 1 to 9. That's not an average of the subscores, by the way. The approach, what you're going to do, usually carries the most weight. But the reviewer will give an overall gestalt, scoring it 1 to 9. Higher score is bad, so a 9 is terrible. A 1 is perfect. I will tell you, in this current funding environment, you got to get 1s and 2s. If you get 3s, you're not getting funded. Maybe for a K at some institutes. If you get 4s, you're definitely not getting funded. So there's lots of very good grant applications out there. They are not funded. If you have a grant that's judged to be satisfactory, I guarantee you it won't be discussed. Okay? So again, if you get a note from somebody saying, well, I would score this grant as very good, that's not a compliment. That's like, oh, you got a C. All right? So you need 1s and 2s, mostly, to get funded in this current environment. 3s, a couple of 3s, maybe. So how do you start? Well, it turns out they give you instructions. A sweet 263 pages of instructions written in federalese for you to begin the writing process. Now, I'll tell you, all those 263 pages are not for your grant, right? Because they have instructions for all different kinds of grants in there. But find the parts that are about your grant that you want to submit. Read them. Read them. If you fail to follow the instructions, it will either not get sent out for review or it'll be reviewed poorly because you didn't read the instructions. They want a certain font. They want a certain font size. They want figure legends that can be legible. So figure legends, table contents can be lower than that, smaller than that 11-point font. But if I have to get a magnifying glass out to read your figure legend, I'm not going to be happy. You want to make me happy, right? So make everything legible. Half-inch margins. If you submit a grant to me that has typical 1-inch margins like you would write a manuscript, I'll know that you don't know what you're doing, right? Because it should be single-spaced, half-inch margins. It should make your high school English teacher's head explode, right? This is not, you don't write like you wrote in high school for these. It's dense, and you want to have almost no white space on that page because you're going to need all that space to tell your story, all right? And so you want to make sure you use those half-inch margins. Single column, not like a manuscript in a journal, but single column of text. Now, as we'll talk about, those are not visually appealing, just giant walls of text. So you're going to want to do something to break that up. One way to do it is to use italics and or bold font to highlight key text that you want the reviewer to remember. If you remember anything from this paragraph, remember this sentence. I'm going to bold that sentence. Okay? The text must be black, but the figures can have color in them. These are distributed by PDF, so I'm going to download them and look on my computer. But I'm also probably going to kill a tree or two, and I'm probably going to print them out and take them with me on the train or have it in my pocket so that if I've had a meeting that's boring, I can read through the grant. And so it's helpful to make sure that any figures that you provide are still legible when printed in black and white. Because if by the time you take these shades of red in your beautiful figure and then print them in black and white and they're now all gray, you can't tell the difference between experimental groups. That doesn't help you. So I would say make it beautiful in color, but make sure that in color, when it prints in black and white, the story is still told by your figure. Yes?
What do you think about underlining?
I talked about italics and bold font. Underlining is also good for this purpose. For any of these, you don't want to overdo it. If half of your text is highlighted in some way, then nothing is highlighted, right? So judicious use of visual aids, including bolding, underlining, and italicizing, can be helpful. Know your page limits. You have them. I promise you have them. And they change from time to time. And so this is an old version of it, so I would encourage you to look at the current version as you're preparing your grant application. But if something says 6 pages, I guarantee you're going to use every bit of that 6 pages. If something is 12 pages, I guarantee you're going to use every bit of that. And understand, there's no flexibility. If it's 13 pages, you will not be permitted to submit. Okay? Now, specifically about K awards, you're going to have to write about you, your background. You're going to write about your career development plan. Who do you want to be? What new are you going to learn? They are not going to fund a K award in which you apply tools and techniques that you already know how to do to a new question. They're not going to fund a K award for that. Right? A K award is a training grant. So you're going to have to identify new tools and techniques that you're going to learn from your mentor or mentors, and then have a bigger, fancier, more impressive toolbox. Who are you going to learn it from? How are you going to learn it? When are you going to learn it? What classes are you going to take? You thought you were done with classes. You're not done with classes, all right? So figure out what graduate level courses you're going to take to bolster your knowledge base. I did it. All of my mentees do it, whether that's biostatistics, experimental biology, molecular biology, immunology, whatever ology you need to have bolstered by this training grant. Take a course in it, or 2 courses, or 3 courses. Doesn't have to be for a degree, but it's for your own learning. It should be for credit. Because if you say, I'm going to audit this class, that gets heard as, I'm not going to go to that class. Right? You want to take it for credit. You want to show a timeline that's believable. I'm going to take 20 hours of credits this semester, and I am going to be a full-time surgeon, and I am going to start a lab. No, you're not. It's got to be believable, okay? So, and you also have to have training in responsible conduct of research, particularly if you're doing human subjects research. Just doing the online city modules is not enough, hasn't been enough for a long time. Ongoing seminars, ongoing training in workshops in responsible conduct research, particularly for those who are doing human subjects research. Here's an example of a timeline from a recent successful K Award from one of my mentees. So it talks about how about the mentors and the in-person meetings. Here's the coursework that's going to happen. Here's the responsible conduct of research. It happens all along. Here's the timeline for the aims being accomplished and goals and clinical administrative time. So the reviewers like this very much. So you have to show them that you've been thoughtful, you've planned this out, you've ordered your experiences in such a way that it leads thoughtfully to the acquisition of new skills. Looks great. It's all going to answer the question of how are you going to become an independent investigator. Now, then your specific aims, the actual stuff you write. This is the most important part of the grant. It is what you should spend the most time on as you are developing a grant application. It is the entire project in one page. One page. I can write a page in an afternoon. It's nothing. Takes me 2 months to write a good aims page. 2 months. Now, I'm on version 85 by the time I'm done with it. I can write one version in a half a day, but it's crap. And it takes months to make a good aims page. It starts with an introductory paragraph. It's a thing. This should look a certain way. I'm used to seeing aims pages appear a certain way. And it starts with a preamble, that introductory paragraph. Why do I care? What gap in literature will this fill? What's your central hypothesis? Why should I fund you to do this? If this project is funded and it's successful, how will it change the field? And then you move from your preamble into the aims themselves. 2 to 4 aims, depending on the scope of the grant. Now, as a K awardee, I ain't gonna believe you can do 4 aims. These are essentially 4 different sets of experiments, 4 different hypotheses you're going to test. If you're writing a multi-group collaborative R01 with 6 co-investigators, okay, 4 aims I might believe. But for K, 2 or 3, right? 2 if they're fat, right? 3, pretty traditional, 2 or 3. Don't get lulled, or at least don't get tempted into making aim 1A, aim 1B, aim 1C, aim 2A, aim 2B, and give me 12 aims embedded in 3 aims. Don't do that. Give me 3 aims, right? Or 2 big aims. This is an example of a successful aims page. It must fit on one page. The aims themselves must be thematically related to the central hypothesis, but must not be dependent on one another. Crafting 3 good aims, 3 different hypotheses, 3 different sets of experiments and analyses that are thematic but not interdependent is really hard. And it's why it takes a long time to put together an aims page. Okay? So what do I mean by interdependent? I mean, if aim 1 is then used to inform aim 2, the results of which are then used to inform aim 3. If aim 1 is unsuccessful, aim 2 and aim 3 are dead. Right? So you can't have aims 2 and 3, 2 or 3, be dependent on aim 1 or any combination thereof. So they have to be freestanding aims, so if one of them or 2 of them completely tank, at least the NIH has some deliverable from your project. They need to be hypothesis-driven. Again, if someone tells you that your aims are descriptive, they have just insulted you. That's not a nice thing to say. Right? The NIH loves to have descriptive data as preliminary data. You read descriptive data in the literature all the time. They hate to pay for it. They want hypothesis-driven work. They expect you to have gone fishing on your fishing expedition in your preliminary data, and then take what you've caught and then make that be the subject of your grant proposal. Right? So you need to use active language in your aims. We are going to identify, we are going to characterize, we're going to determine, not we're going to look for, we're going to evaluate, we're going to measure. Okay? We want active language. You got to be feasible. If you're describing that you're going to study 100,000 patients with spinal muscular atrophy at Nationwide Children's Hospital in 3 years, I'm going to say, no, you're not. They don't exist. Okay? So your sample size has to be feasible. The scope of your work has to be feasible. The timeline of your work has to be feasible. You got to be able to read it, and it must impart enthusiasm. You have to, in the first sentence of each section, particularly in the specific aims and significance, make the person say, well, that's terrible, and we need to fix this. We need to fix this right now. You have to impart enthusiasm. If the person is asleep by the time they get halfway through the aims page, your grant will not get funded. Budget time for this. Remember I told you, take the submission date and roll the clock backwards? I'm talking roll it back 6 months. All right? Start with your aims page. What's the problem? Why should I care about it? What's our knowledge gap? Why are you the person to do it? What's your central hypothesis? And how will the successful testing of that hypothesis advance the field? That's all in that top bit. That's essentially your whole grant in the first half of a page. It's tough. Now, the research strategy, you have more space. It's the body of the grant. It has, the longest section, either 6 or 12, depending on what funding opportunity you're applying for. And it starts with a significance. Why should I care? A couple of pages, a little bit less maybe, all right, depending on your space. Then innovation, what's new and hot about it? Why is it different? Often a page or less, depending on the space. I'll tell you, K awards often suffer with low innovation, all right? That's okay. Innovation equals risk. Right? And I don't want your K award to be terribly risky. I want your K award to be a slam dunk. You're going to learn stuff. You're going to develop into an independent investigator. I don't care that you get a 1 for innovation. If you do, something's probably weird about your K award. Right? Your K award innovation score is probably not going to be that great. And that's probably all right. Then there's the approach. What are you going to do? This is the biggest part of your research strategy. You typically do this in the order of your specific aims, starting with an introduction, preliminary data, methods, including statistical analysis plan, what you expect to find, the experimental concerns, pitfalls, future directions, and highlighting the scientific premise, rigor, and reproducibility. If there's a certain set of general experimental methods that you're going to use for all your aims, this is my approach to cell culture, this is my approach to the rat injury model, you can put that at the end in a general research methods section. Okay? There is a relatively new requirement for reviewers to comment on rigor and transparency. They want you to highlight the scientific premise. They want you to highlight how rigorous you're going to be, how you're going to know that your results are true. They want, if you have homebrew antibodies or other homebrew reagents, how do you authenticate those key biologics to make sure they're of high quality? Are you going to make sure that you enroll men and women and other key biological variables? I have learned to put specific headers in each of my aims sections in the research strategy that addresses these so the reviewer can't miss them. Now, this is a successful K award application, and this person's English teacher is undoubtedly unhappy with the way this looks. Okay? This is a dense wall of text, okay? And half-inch margins, single space, 11-point font, very judicious spacing, very little white space on there because you need that space to tell your story. But you notice that there are visuals on every page to help break up the text. There's a figure, there might be a table, there's a picture, so that the reader at least gets a little bit of a break from the giant wall of text, at least in the early going of the grant. During your methods and so forth, it's more common to have walls of text. But they're separated. Important text is bolded, so if the person only remembers that bolded sentence from that paragraph, we're okay. Right? Certain things are underlined. They're divided into sections that are logical. And first sentence, every 3 hours, one child dies from a burn injury. I want to read this thing. I want to fund this thing, because if we can stop that, that'd be great. All right? It may sound a bit overdramatic. It's not. You have to compete with everybody else who's writing things, and I guarantee you, everybody else is going to tell you that their thing is the worst thing on the planet. We got to make it go away. So you got to do it too. Got to be truthful. But if you start by quoting dry statistics, it's going to make people not want to read the rest of your proposal. So impart enthusiasm. So again, I use at least one visual to break up walls of text, at least until I get to the methods. Use bullet points. Avoid redundancy. Again, if you say the same thing in the same language 8 different times in your proposal, I'm thinking, okay, you must not have a lot to say because you keep saying that same thing over and over again. It's a little irritating. Right? Now, sometimes that happens when you write these things in blocks. And then when you stitch them all together, you realize that you've said the same thing in each of your blocks. And you have to go back and edit. That's why you write, you rewrite, you rewrite, you rewrite. And you have lots of folks reviewing these along with you. It's okay, however, to provide short summaries that impart to the reader a reminder that this point is important. There's nothing more frustrating than having a reviewer say, well, the author did not address this issue. Then you look in your proposal and you addressed it very clearly on the 8th sentence of the 14th paragraph of the research strategy. But you only said it once, and it was a really important point. You didn't highlight it anywhere else. So you can use, as this person did, summary sections that can, in a bullet point fashion, highlight pieces of information you want people to know. Less is more. Put away your thesaurus. I don't want big flowery words. I want concise, accurate words. Short words. Don't be flowery. Assume nothing about the reviewer. The one thing you can assume about the reviewer is that they're smart. Right? You don't get to be on study section without being smart. Right? But even though it might be going to an immunobiology study section, let's say, they might know nothing about the specific molecule you're interested in or even the cell type you're interested in. The people at the Center for Scientific Review try to send the grants out to people whose expertise matches the content, but don't assume that it will, because sometimes you will have people who are smart, knowledgeable about some parts of your science, who won't understand the jargon that you're using. So don't use jargon, and if you do, explain it the first time you use it. Explain things overtly. A nice way to test this is to give your grant to a smart person, a colleague, friend, who is not in your field. They should be able to understand it. And if they don't, there's a problem. If it's confusing, it's your fault. When you get that bad review back, ooh, you'll be so angry. But the person you should be angry about is you. So think about the budget. We're running a little bit over here, so we're going to blaze through some of this. You get money for science. You get money for salary support, travel. Your institution also gets money to help keep the lights on. Those are called indirect costs. You don't have to budget those. Your institution budgets those. We're going to blaze through budget. Be aware, though, for a K, you don't get much money for science. You get a little bit of money for science. You're supposed to be nourished by your institutional startup package and your mentor, along with whatever monies you get from the K. So the K is primarily salary support with a wee little bit of money for science. And there are experts, sponsored projects officers, centers for clinical research, et cetera. And of course, your mentor that can help you build your budget. There's lots of little stuff. There's a whole bunch of stuff we're going to go through here in a short period of time. Biosketch. So if you have not created a Biosketch, please understand it's a thing. It's a very specific thing. It's not a resume. It is a resume that is formatted according to very specific NIH structure. One of the first things you do is go to PubMed and CBI and make what's called My Bibliography. It is a way for you to go through PubMed and send any publications that are attributed to you in any authorship position to you in a file that is then linked to a URL that you can copy and paste into emails and biosketches and other things. So you go to PubMed to find a publication of yours. You click on Send To up here in this thing. Click on My Bibliography, and it sends it to your bibliography. Right? And then you will have a URL link that you can copy and put in your Biosketch. Make sure things are accurate. For Ks, it's okay to put chapters and reviews. I wouldn't put an abstract in there. It should be something that's published. Right? If you're applying for an R award, you can't put reviews and textbook chapters in there because they're not peer-reviewed literature. Right? So just be aware of that. And reviewers know that K award applicants have thinner biosketches than R applicants. It's okay. That's why they allow you to put review articles and chapters on there, because it makes it look a little bit less empty. But it's all right. That's taken into account. I would strongly encourage you not to put in preparation. Right? If you're a K applicant and you want to put in revision, okay, maybe. At least it tells you it's been reviewed favorably enough to resubmit. But in preparation is code word for I haven't done it yet. Right? And if everything you've got is in preparation, it's off-putting. Right? So I wouldn't even put those on your CV. Each Biosketch has a personal statement. It goes in the front. It's the preamble. It's free space. It allows you to say stuff about your project that you might not be able to fit in other parts of your application. It allows you to talk about things like mentorship and institutional support and the scientific importance of your work and why you're the right person to do it here. Now, everybody else who writes a personal statement for your grant needs to write a personal statement that's specific to your grant. So, yes, I am aware of Dr. Hall's proposal. I support it. Here's why I think it's a good idea, and I agree to be a part of it. It's really irritating when someone's personal statement refers to some other grant, and they've just sent you an old personal statement, an old Biosketch for you to upload. Read them. Make sure that your contributors, that include your mentor, your co-mentor, your advisory committee members, your collaborators, haven't done that. You need to write an original personal statement for each Biosketch that they create. And so you then are able to identify areas of science, areas of contribution to science, and put a little paragraph about your contribution and up to 4 references that support your role in that contribution to science. Again, K applicants, we get you might have 1 or 2 areas of contribution to science, if that. We get that you're early. It's okay. But got to come up with at least 1, maybe 2. And they don't have to be as robust as, say, mine would be, but that's okay. Be able to articulate some way that you have contributed to science. Yes?
When you're doing your contributions to science, you may have done some work, for instance, as a fellow.
Yeah.
That you're not really doing as much anymore.
Yes.
Does this need to be as specific for the grant that you're submitting? Hey, I've done
No.
this already for the K.
But definitely at the K stage. If you've done it, put it on there.
Yeah.
Right? What it tells me is that you've been a part of the scientific method. You've been taught how to think. You've been taught how to publish. You have contributed to science in some way. If you've done 2 or 3 things, and one of them is really germane to the proposal you're putting in, I'd lead with that one. And then here's those other things I've done earlier in my career that provides evidence that I have some science chops.
But you wouldn't remove them.
No, definitely not at the K stage. Absolutely not. And here's where you put in your URL for your list of publications from my bibliography, and then any research support or grants that you've had. And there are page limits here as well, so be aware of that. Briefly, letters of support. I'll wrap up soon, so yeah. You have to get letters of support from your research advisory committee members, your collaborators, your co-investigators if you have them. The official mentor, primary mentor, has an actual mentor statement that's part of the grant. So you don't need a letter from them. You need this bigger thing that includes that table I referred to of people that they've mentored. But everybody else does need to provide a letter. 2 pages maximum. Less is more. If they can get it on 1 page, great. You might, depending on the mechanism, have some of those letters count in your page limits. So you're going to want them to be definitely no more than 1 page. And sometimes you might have to futz with the margins and squeeze it down to get onto 1 page. So I ask people to send them to me as PDF and Word documents in the event that I have to do some arts and crafts with it. We can do that in a Word document, but not with a PDF. Here's a cool thing. You get to write their letter of recommendation. I'm going to say that again. You write the letter of recommendation or support. You write it. Because I'm busy. If I got to write this letter de novo, I'll put that over here. I'll get to it. If you have written it, now all I got to do is edit it. It takes a lot less time, and I can turn it around to you quickly. So what you do is you say, Dr. Hall, I have taken the liberty of drafting a letter of support from you. Please feel free to edit as you see fit, put on your letterhead, sign, and return to me by email. Thank you very much. Oh, I love that so much. It's much less work for me. I can do that in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, tops, all right? If I have to write one de novo, that's a half hour, and I got to block it out, and it may or may not get done on time, right? So you write these. You write all of them. Have them send you as PDF and Word. Don't make them sound the same. This is the hard part. You're writing 8 letters of recommendation who all use the exact same phrase or structured the exact same way. As a reviewer, I'm going, he wrote all these. He wrote all of them. At least do me the courtesy of trying to make it look like these people wrote their own letters of recommendation. Okay? But, and in fact, some of your letters will come back heavily edited because the person wants to put their own stamp on it, and that's okay. But start by doing their work for them and letting them fix it. You need to let the NIH know what you got. So there are places for you to talk about budget justification. I'm sorry, for facilities and equipment. Then there's budget justification, where you tell the NIH why you want the money that you want. What are you going to use it for? Who are the people that you're going to employ? What are they going to do? Do you have equipment you're going to buy? Again, for Ks, the budget is so fixed. This is usually not very complicated, much more important for Rs and bigger grants. There's a very new section called Human Subjects and Clinical Trials. There's a whole series of fields that you have to complete. I encourage you to read this section, to walk through it, and to work, if you are doing human subjects or clinical trials work, with people who have experience in this regard, so that you budget time. It takes time to get these sections done. You'll need to talk about the demographics of the people that you plan to study and make sure that your sample is not biased. You'll have to put together a table of inclusion, how you perceive, you expect racial and ethnic groups to be represented within your cohort. There's a long section on protection of human subjects. This is very carefully read and evaluated. It covers a whole host of topics and has a whole bunch of different fields on these topics, and it takes time. If you wait for this, to do this on the day of submission, you will be screwed, all right? You have to do this well ahead of time because there's a lot of work that goes into these bits. Now, let's say you get your application back and it was scored, but not funded. Means I got to make it better. I got to revise it. So you are given an opportunity to summarize the relevant critiques, to give a point-by-point response to those critiques, a clear summary of the new elements of the application in one page. It cannot spread one line over onto a second page. One page. And so it's titled The Introduction to the Revised Application. That's what they call it. You tell them what they liked about it. You remind them that. You like this part, remember? And you kind of hated this, and here's how we've made it better. And you address changes using either bullets or numbered responses. Don't write angry. Whose fault is it that it didn't get funded? Yours. Absorb it, internalize it, don't write angry, be polite. Now, as promised, this is a resource that I like. It's the Grant Application Writer's Workbook. I provide it to all of my fellows and junior faculty members, particularly those that are looking like NIH type folks. It is detailed, but not so detailed that it's not readable. And it walks you through the whole process, soup to nuts. And I would make sure that whatever version of this you get is the most recent version, because the NIH rules do change from time to time. But just their approach to writing and approach to structuring grants is, I think, really, really good. And I've been successful using tips from it, as have many, many others. So it's hard, it's long. Read the directions, please. Create really solid, specific aims before you start to write the grant. All right? Once your aims page is done, the grant sort of writes itself. I mean, you know what you're going to write about, but the aims page is the hardest bit to get started with. Write succinctly but compellingly. Budget time for all the parts of the grants, not just the aims page and not just the research strategy. There's lots of bits and pieces that will bite you in the backside if you don't give time to get them ready, because they are part of the review process. And for those of you that are intimidated, please understand that an unsubmitted grant has zero chance of being funded. So get on the horse, and I hope you're successful. All right, sorry I went over, but thank you. Happy to take some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Better during your resubmission, would it be viewed badly that you were rejected the first time?
So the question is it better to wait for, is it better to wait for a perfect grant, or should you submit one that you know has flaws? There's no such thing as a perfect grant. If you wait for it to be perfect, you'll never submit it. But as I alluded to before, you want to get as close to it as you can reasonably do. Sometimes there are political pressures. Let's say you have a milestone, or else if you don't submit a grant this cycle, your startup package will be taken away from you. That's a pretty good reason to submit a grant. So you have to consider that. Having said that, the grant reviewing community is small. And as I mentioned, the people on study section typically serve for a couple of years. So they will probably see your grants come back as you revise and resubmit. And you don't want to get a reputation of submitting crap. You want to get a reputation of being thoughtful and submitting a high-quality proposal. Maybe it doesn't get funded, but it should not have fatal flaws that are obvious. This would reflect badly on you, and it would also reflect badly on your mentor. So if they write in the critique, it looks like a smart person didn't help this person with their application, that reflects poorly on Dr. So-and-so as a mentor. I have real concerns about this person. Now you got that hanging on your back as you're trying to write a revision and make that really good. So I would say that's a judgment call between you and your mentor, and you and your bosses. How politically important is it for you to submit a grant in a given cycle? Is the grant ready? And if it's not ready, there's no shame in pulling it and giving it another cycle to improve. But if you keep doing that because it's not perfect, you'll never submit it. So it's a judgment call you and your mentor have to make. All right, well, thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.